In this episode, we install the new fuel tank in our Grady White Adventure 208. Dealing with a few unexpected issues along the way. When we purchased the Grady, we knew that the fuel tank had a few issues. It was full of water and quite crusty looking, and in episode 3 of this series, we removed the old tank. After a scrub, it didn't look too bad, but it did have some corrosion in spots. You can see here where the tank was resting on some old black rubbing strips, more on that later, as well as some other pitting and corrosion on the bottom of the tank. All up, we needed a new tank, but which one? We're in Bermuda, which is in the mid-Atlantic, not the Caribbean, and it's approximately 600 miles east of the US. You may have heard of the Bermuda Triangle, which is approximately between Florida, Puerto Rico and Bermuda. Island living means that when shopping, choice is relatively limited and things are much more expensive than in mainland countries. The label on the old tank said it was made by Florida Marine Tanks, and they still seem to be in business. But unfortunately, they didn't respond to my emails. I did find this option online for a similar Grady, but the sender seems to be in the wrong spot for the inspection hatch. It needs to be a little bit closer to the edge. Shipping to a US address was also more than half the cost of the new tank. I use a freight forwarder, which usually saves on shipping costs, but sending something like a fuel tank to Bermuda is very expensive. There are plenty of off-the-shelf options in the States, as well as custom tanks, but the big cost is shipping to Bermuda. If possible, it's also good to support local businesses, and I did find one local fabricator, Stuart Lunn, who came highly recommended. And while a custom tank was more expensive than off-the-shelf models, without the shipping costs, it was a lot cheaper. The new tank was smaller than the original, but still over 200 litres, and made from a single 4x8 aluminium sheet with quality stainless fittings and welded support tabs. To calculate the volume, we needed to account for the trapezoid shape on the bottom as well as the material thickness. My estimate has the volume at a little less than 240 litres, or around 60 to 64 odd gallons. The tank requires 3 hoses: the fill hose, the line from the tank to the motor, and a vent. The original hoses were 30 odd years old and had seen better days. The fill hose also had some weird jelly stuff inside it. The fill cap was on the starboard gunnel near the helm, and access to the fill and vent hoses was limited, either from an old speaker hole or further back along the cockpit coaming. The ends came out under the helm. The green wire is the ground from the fill cap to the tank. There wasn't a lot of access to disconnect the hoses, and the screw or bolt heads for the hose clamps or Jubilee clips were inaccessible. I decided to try and cut the fill hose with a multi-tool. It's easier said than done. I think this wire is a tether, so the fuel fill cap doesn't fall overboard. Anyway, I was finally able to cut the hose and get the fuel fill cap out. Access was still terrible, however, so I made the decision to cut a hole in the coaming. There wasn't a lot of space for a jigsaw or multi-tool, so I used a drill. To pull the new hoses through, I connected them to the old hoses with plastic hose joiners secured with screws. I also tied on a new grounding wire. But pulling the hoses through was a real challenge. I ended up inching the hose through using hose clamps and a crowbar. One clamp wasn't enough. At a couple of inches at a time, this process took ages. Finally, the new hose was through. This is the old line. It's about 7 feet long. The black tape is where I secured the green grounding wire. It was time for the vent, also secured with a hose joiner and screws. Fortunately, the vent hose was a lot easier to get through. Near the fill cap, the vent hose needed a U-bend to help prevent water getting into the tank. This required a stainless spring to stop the hose kinking. The fill hose was double clamped. Before we could connect the hoses, we needed to secure the tank. The old tank was held in place by 3 2x4s screwed into the side bulkheads. The tank had been sitting on some old black rubbing strips, and that had contributed to the corrosion below. To support the new tank and allow water to drain in the bilge, I made some strips out of 1/2-inch starboard, which for those in Australia is high density polyethylene or HDPE with some UV inhibitors. I secured these to the tank with Sikaflex 291 to stop moisture getting trapped and causing corrosion. The new tank wasn't heavy, but it was bulky and awkward. The tank was positioned so that the sender was underneath the inspection port. There was a gap between the support tabs and the fore and aft bulkhead of about 50 to 60 millimetres. To help fill the gap, I tabbed in some 19mm Coosa strips with 1708 fiberglass and epoxy. There was still a bit of a gap, so I used some more starboard as shims. Holes in the Coosa were pre-drilled and filled with thickened epoxy. tank was secured with stainless steel carriage bolts with butyl tape between the stainless and aluminium to help prevent corrosion. As the width between the bulkheads wasn't even, and the starboard was too thick for some tabs, I made up some shims out of 1708 and epoxy so they would be waterproof. When filling the tank, to help prevent static electricity causing sparks, the fuel cap should be grounded to the tank and the sender needs to be wired up to the fuel gauge. Stuart Lunn had drilled and tapped screw holes for the sender, but the aluminium is quite thin and care is required so the threads aren't stripped. This was the ground wire from the fill cap. I got a Ryobi battery powered heat gun which has been really useful with the wiring. You might notice some new glasswork on the aft bulkhead. This is due to a problem I found when installing the line from the tank to the engine. The old hose went through the aft bulkhead with some sealant to help keep the moisture away from the plywood. Unfortunately, over the last 30 odd years, it failed. This is on the motor well side of the bulkhead. The second hose is seawater to this locker, which I guess can be a live bait tank. The sealant had also gone where the sender wires go through the bulkhead, allowing moisture in. I had checked the bulkhead with a moisture meter, but used a cheaper model that didn't cope with fiberglass well. You can get ones for fiberglass, but they are a lot more expensive. These prices are in Australian dollars. They are about $600 to $700 US. Here you can see once the fiberglass is removed, the meter goes off the scale. There seemed a fair bit of water trapped between the wood and the glass. The worst damage was where the hose and the wires went through the bulkhead. And while the wood was wet, it was still fairly solid and took a long time to remove with a chisel. I also removed some old decking between the tank and the bulkhead, along with some wood from the side fore and aft bulkheads, but after a few inches it was pretty dry and solid. I replaced the wet plywood with some kusa I had left over from the transom repair and glassed it in with layers of 1708 and epoxy. I also replaced the subdeck. Finally, I could connect the hose from the tank to the motor as well as the new sender wires. The next step is to connect the sender wires to the fuel gauge, but that'll have to wait for another episode. Thanks for watching.